All right, hello and welcome to our third unit of Microservices March, Accelerate Microservices Deployments with Automation. I see some familiar names in the chat from people who were here in previous units, so welcome back and welcome to anybody who's just joining us. My name is Jen Guile. I'll be your host and facilitator for the session. And so we'll start off with some housekeeping and then we'll jump in with our guest speaker, Christopher, in just a moment. So as a reminder, we're offering a badge this year. If you attend all 4 webinars and complete all 4 hands-on labs, you're eligible for the badge. You just need to use the same email address across all of them so that we can link you together. And if you complete a lab and you're not sure if it shows complete or not, you can ping us over Slack and we can confirm that for you. Secondly, join us on Slack. We have a channel called Microservices March. If you look at the resources little paperclip icon in your video UI, you'll see a link to join Slack. That's a really great place to come and ask questions about the labs, general microservices questions, and general NGINX questions. And then finally, the format for this session, we're going to have 3 parts. The first will be a lecture format where we'll take questions throughout if they're relevant to what Christopher's talking about, but otherwise we'll hold them for a Q&A period that we'll do through the On24 Q&A. So if you have a question, please pop it in there. We'll also be monitoring the attendee chat. And then roughly 45 to 60 minutes in, so around 9 o'clock Pacific time, we'll transition to doing office hours when you can complete our hands-on lab in this time so that you can ask questions as you go through. You're not required to stay and do the lab during that period, but we're here if you want to do that. And then, of course, if this is on demand later, sorry, no office hours, but we will answer questions on Slack. Okay, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Christopher from GitHub. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for the introduction, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone that's joined, depending on where in the world you happen to be. As Jen mentioned, my name is Christopher. I'm a senior enterprise advocate at GitHub. I've been a developer for quite a while. I have a little bit more of a focus on DevOps these days, which we'll introduce and talk about here in a minute. And I've been playing around and working with microservices for quite a while now. I actually remember this might have been, oh gosh, I don't know, maybe about 8 years ago. I remember one of the senior engineers at Microsoft came in and actually did a little bit of a presentation to our team talking about some of the things that were coming out in the future. And he mentioned this thing called containers. And he mentioned this ability to have like a smaller VM, and then that was just going to have like my database, or that was just going to have like a part of my web app, or it was just going to be able to like do a couple of services, and it wasn't going to need the full operating system, that it would sit on top of things, and there would be all of these different layers of abstraction. And I remember just like having my mind blown, because at the time, like virtual machines were still like kind of becoming a thing. So seeing that we could take that and make that even smaller and think about the level of flexibility that that was going to give us was really quite remarkable. And so ever since then, I've been very interested in this space and exploring it, and really appreciate the amount of, well, again, power and flexibility that this gives us, both when we're doing our development, but also when it comes time to deploy out the applications and the projects that we are building out. Now, what I want to do here is start by taking a look at DevOps, kind of like what the process is, and then eventually how we're going to deploy out those microservices. Because after all, everything that we've built out, we're going to want to be able to share that out with the world. How do we do that? Let's explore that here. So first question then is, what is DevOps? And put succinctly, DevOps is the union of people, processes, and products to enable continuous delivery of value to our end users. And I want to break that down a little bit here because you're going to notice there's three very big moving parts that come together. Number one is the people. That's going to be all of us. We're all going to have a job to play. And that might be that I'm writing the code. That might be that I'm building out the tooling that's going to push things out. It might be that I'm doing some form of interactive QA, but I'm going to have a job. So we're bringing people together. The next is processes. How are we going to ensure that when we make a change here, that it goes through all of the appropriate steps and then eventually gets pushed out? How do we make sure that we're not introducing bugs? How do we make sure that we're not introducing new security vulnerabilities? All of that is part of the process that we're going to define. And then last but not least is the products. That's the technology. Those are all the different tools that we're going to use to make that magic happen. So that's what we're trying to do here. So what are we trying to solve? We want consistency and repeatability. I want to make sure that every time that I introduce a change, it goes through that exact same process and winds up on the other end correct. And I also want to make sure that if things go wrong, that I have the ability to very quickly recover. I want to make sure that we're shipping the right thing, the right changes at the right time to the right places. And then last but not least is I want to minimize downtime and maximize recovery. That the old school way of doing things is that when we push out a new update, we're going to take the website down for a half hour. We're going to take the website down for an entire day. Like, that's not a good approach in today's world where everybody expects everything to be available 24/7. So we want to make sure that we're minimizing downtime, but we also want to acknowledge the fact that things are still going to happen. Bugs still ship out. And so as a result, we want to make sure that we're making it very easy to recover as quickly as possible. So how do we do this? Well, number one is we need to establish best practices. So what is it that we need to make sure that happens every time? Number two, identify stakeholders. Every project that I've ever been a part of that had a failure on it, it was almost always because we didn't identify the right people to be in charge of certain parts of the process. So we want to figure out what roles all of our different people are going to play. And then last but not least is find the right tools that will allow us to then do everything that we want to do. Okay. Now, this whole session is about deploying out our microservices. And so I want to define a couple of different terms here because I find that they're used quite frequently interchangeably. And that is continuous integration and continuous delivery deployment. So continuous integration is the process of me making changes to my code and incorporating them into my code base. And as part of that process, I want to make sure that any of the changes that I'm making don't break anything. So I want to make sure that I've got good unit tests. I want to make sure that everything is still going to build correctly. So all of that's going to be part of continuous integration. So I'm taking all of my changes, all of my code updates, putting that into the code base. We know that that's going to work. Continuous integration. Continuous delivery or continuous deployment, that second word there will vary depending on who it is that you're talking to. And some people will get like really overly semantic about the difference between the two. And I'm not going to dig into that. I don't think it's necessarily overly important for what we're trying to do here. But continuous delivery, continuous deployment is now us taking those updates that we've made and pushing them out to where they need to be, to making them available to our customers. So that's going to be pushing that out maybe to a staging server to do some last minute testing, or pushing that out to a production server. So now the world is going to be able to use that. So continuous integration, all those changes go in, and then continuous delivery deployment, all of those changes now go out to the world. Now, when we're talking about microservices, we have challenges that are unique to this. So number one is service compatibility. Remember, of course, that with a microservice, I'm going to have one little app over here that's going to do something, and I'm going to have another little app over here that's going to do something, and another little app over here that's going to do something. And they're going to be talking to one another. And if I make a change here, I need to make sure that those changes are still compatible over here and still compatible over here. So when I'm thinking about how am I going to be designing everything, I need to make sure that we're running some tests to ensure compatibility. And I also need to make sure that when we go to deploy everything, that we're deploying everything out in one shot, that we're deploying everything out correctly, so that way all of the right versions are all sent out properly. Next is my downtime concerns. Again, I've got all those different services, and this one that's sitting right here, that could be used by like 5 other places. So if this goes down, or if I need to take this service down as I'm deploying out a new version, that's not just going to impact this service here, but it's going to impact all of the other ones that depend on it. And you might have a very overly complex system where maybe like I've got, this is now being called by this service over here is being called by like 5 others. And now we could really just have a cascade effect where one little item over here goes down, and that's going to have a very large rippling impact on everything else. So we need to make sure that we're minimizing or completely eliminating downtime. Directly related to that is rollback requirements. That one of the things that's unfortunately going to happen is regardless of how much testing we do, regardless of how good our staging environment is, where we're doing all of those last minute checks, bad code does still sometimes get pushed out. This happens. And so we want to make sure that we can detect that very quickly and be able to roll back very quickly. This is really going to be the primary focus of what we'll be doing in our lab, is we're going to push something out. We're going to check to see, hey, is it working? And if it's not, let's go ahead and roll that back. And then last but not least is I need to make sure that I'm taking into account those environment differences. So if I'm doing my testing on staging, when I go to push that out to production, that's going to be a different environment. We're using different databases. We're using different services. So I need to make sure that everything is working properly across the board. So all of this is to say that we've got some unique challenges here. So how do we then address those? Well, let's get on into it. So I want to start by talking a little bit about the continuous integration part, and then we'll build into that deployment. So here is how we're going to make changes, what that flow is going to look like, and that's then going to lead us into how we'll deploy out that code. So the GitHub flow, how do we make changes? How do we incorporate everything? Well, step one is when we go to make changes is let's create what's known as a brand new branch. So what a branch is going to be is that's going to be a copy of that code. And what's great about that is that's going to be separate from my mainline code. So I can make all of my changes down here. I can play, I can explore, I can try new things and not have to worry about breaking anything on that main branch. And now once I finally get to a point where I realize, hey, everything is looking really good here. I think I've got something. I'm ready to bring this into the main code base. I'm now going to open up what's known as a pull request. Now, when I first started in this space, pull push sort of like confused me a little bit. And here's sort of what that terminology is going to wind up meaning. I'm writing some code here, and I'm doing all of that locally. The actual code base, though, is going to sit out on a server somewhere. So when I want to take my changes and push them up there, I'm going to make a push. So I'm now taking my local code and I'm pushing that somewhere. But just because I push that up somewhere, doesn't mean that somebody else is then going to accept that. This is where that pull part comes into play, is that they need to allow that to come in. They need to pull that code in. And so this pull request is me going, hey, I've got some code I think you would like. Can you pull this in? So that's what's going to happen right here. Now, once I've suggested those changes here as part of a pull request, now other developers are going to come in and take a look at what I've done. And they're going to go, hey, this looks really, really good. Or maybe they're going to go, hey, this is missing something. Or this doesn't behave the way that we expect. Or this needs a test. And all of that's okay, because that back and forth is how we're going to make great software. And that's really what we're trying to do, right? So we're going to go ahead and we're going to have all of those conversations. And then once we go, hey, this looks good, then we'll go ahead, run it through our validation process, and then merge that in to our main code base. So that is the flow. Cool. So once we've gone through that process and we've merged in that code and we go, hey, this looks really, really good, how do we then get that out? Well, one way that we could do that is we could manually start running through all of that. But that's not going to scale, and that's also going to be very error prone. So this is where we want to get into some level of automation. Automation really is a key to having a successful software development environment. Because with automation, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a whole bunch of tasks that I don't necessarily like, tasks that are going to take me out of the flow, tasks that require consistency, tasks that are maybe going to be long running that I don't necessarily want to have to sit around and wait for them to complete, and automate all of that process. So how do we do automation? How do we do automation with GitHub? We do that by using GitHub Actions. So in a nutshell, here's what GitHub Actions are all about. On any repository that you have, you're going to have an Actions tab. And on my Actions tab, I'm going to have a collection of workflows. Those are all of the different blocks of automation that we're going to have. And so that could be scanning my code for vulnerabilities. That could be running my unit tests. That could be, in our case, deploying our code out. Now, what's really cool about all of this is that those automations are going to be defined as YAML files. For those of you not already familiar with YAML, YAML stands for yet another markup language, because that's what we needed. And it's a white space based definition language. That's the phrasing that I want to use there. And what's great about this being YAML files is the fact that that's now going to become part of my repository. That's going to become part of my source code. So when this repository maybe goes somewhere else, my configuration goes along with it. Or if I set up certain processes that I want to make sure are followed, that maybe I only want certain people to make changes to those workflows, I can enforce that by using the exact same tools that I would use to enforce restrictions on anything else inside of my repository. So all of that's going to be right there that I'm going to be able to see as the developer, as the DevOps specialist, as the sysadmin. And then last but not least, when I go to create a brand new workflow, that I can use one of the suggested workflows that are right here, which are dynamically set up based on the type of project that I'm using, or I can create my own. Now, one of the truisms about development in general is the fact that we're not launching rockets here. And the point that I'm making when I say that is whatever it is that we're doing, somebody else has already done. So rather than me necessarily going out and building something completely from scratch, what I can do is build upon the work of others. And this is where the GitHub Actions Marketplace comes into play. And so what we're going to see is a whole bunch of actions that have been defined by different vendors, defined by the community, that I can then use to piece together everything without having to create a whole bunch of things from scratch. I don't necessarily have to write a whole bunch of code. I can go grab the components that I need, set up a little bit of configuration, and then away I go. All right. So how do I build an action? I'm glad that you asked. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a YAML file. And inside that YAML file, I'm going to have a name. And then I'm going to define what's known as a trigger. And a trigger is what's going to cause this workflow to run. And there's a lot of different triggers that are available. So we can choose to do this on push. We can do this based on a pull request. We could do this on a schedule. We could do this manually. We could do this when issues are created. Basically, if anybody sneezes in the general direction of the repository, I can do something in response to that. Well, what can I do in response to that? Well, I can run a job. And what that job is going to contain is a couple of very key pieces of information. The first is the runner. Where are we going to run this bit of automation? And so you could choose to run this on Windows, on Mac, or in this case, we're going to run this on Ubuntu. And then the next thing is, what do we actually want to do? And so I can choose to run a manual script. Maybe it's a bash script. I could choose one of the actions, and then I can provide whatever additional information it is that I need right from here. So I can put all of that together to build out my action. All right. So now that we've got our action kind of covered, and we'll get into the demo here in just a minute to bring it all together, how do we ensure that we're going to have a smooth deployment? So there's a couple of different concepts that we can take into account here to help ensure that things are going to go well. The first is what's known as a Canary deployment. And so with a Canary deployment, I'm going to take whatever that service or whatever that group of services is, and I'm going to push that out somewhere. I'm going to push that out to a production environment, but I'm going to hide it. So nobody else from the outside world is going to be able to see it, but I am. And with that sitting there kind of hidden, I'm now going to test it. I'm going to poke at it. I'm going to run some set of unit tests. And so that might be that I'm running a real quick health check on it. Just, is it alive? That might be that I'm running through some integration tests. Can it talk to a database? Can it perform certain operations? And once those tests have run, and I go, hey, this looks good, then I could go ahead and light that service up, bring it to life, and now the general public is going to start using it. They're now going to see that new version. So that Canary deployment, let me put it somewhere, let me go ahead and test it, make sure it works. And then once we confirm that it works, we'll go ahead and bring it to life. The other very important concept, and kind of closely related, is what's known as a blue-green deployment. See, one of the things that we were talking about earlier is if I deploy out a service, but that's going to incur downtime, especially when we're talking about microservices, that can have a rippling effect. So now not only is that service going to have some bit of downtime, but now all of the services that depend on it are also going to have downtime. So with a blue-green deployment, what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to slowly start migrating traffic over to that new service until eventually all traffic is now using that updated service. And what's really nice about a blue-green deployment is that it gives me an extra ability to both eliminate downtime, but also do some additional checks. So when we run through that Canary deployment, typically what you're doing is you're just going, hey, is this working? Is this behaving the way that I expect? And if the answer is yes, fantastic, flip it on. But what happens if I've got a service that's being used by thousands and thousands, potentially millions of people? Just doing a real quick health check doesn't tell me everything. Do I have performance issues? Do I have maybe a bug that's only going to surface itself when the service is hit at load? I don't know. That's what a blue-green deployment will allow me to find out. So by slowly migrating traffic over, if we get to a particular point where we realize, hey, wait a minute, something's not behaving the way that we expect it, we can now go ahead and revert that back. So we can bring back the last known good. We can flip everybody back over to the service that we know works, and then we could go back and figure out what went wrong and then try this again later. Now, there's actually an awful lot of other things that you can start to do here to kind of control how all of this behaves. And we could literally spend the entire day talking about all the different possibilities and strategies and so forth. But my primary goal here was really to highlight kind of the high-level concepts and the key things that we want to know, the key things that we want to be aware of for when it comes time to push out our microservices. Now, in the demo that I'm going to do, which is going to kind of real quickly walk through the lab that you'll have, we're going to see how we can do this with a single service. Now, the reason that we did this with a single service is because of the fact that trying to do this with multiple services is potentially going to add some additional complexity. And we wanted to be able to focus in on how do we do this with one component. And so that's where we're going to start. That's what we're going to do with our demo here. Now, I'm bringing up the service in the background here. If you kind of saw maybe like a light lighting change as my monitor flipped around, I was bringing up the lab environment. It's spinning up now in the background. So I'm going to go ahead and pause and see if there are any questions.
We have a lot of questions.
I see that.
Let's see. Do you want to start with the more human-focused about the difference between roles? Do you want to talk about a little bit more in the weeds around blue-green deployments? What do you think?
Let's start a little bit on the roles. So
all right.
The difference
I will go
between
ahead and get this up so everybody can see it because they can't see it yet.
Okay.
So the question, yeah, go ahead.
Oh yeah. So the question, difference between DevOps and SRE, sysadmin, cloud engineer, always been confusion about what DevOps does. So when it comes to SRE and some of like, I'm trying to find the right word here, like newer versions, if you will, of how to approach this. I'm not necessarily going to dig too deep into all of that. And I'm also openly going to admit that I'm not overly familiar with some of kind of like the recent changes that have necessarily taken in this split. But what I am going to say is we are always seeing changes, that we've seen things like application lifecycle management or ALM in the past. And then we have got DevOps here, and then we've got SRE, and then we're going to find something else new in 5 years. That's just sort of like this approach, because after all, writing code is still like a relatively new space, and we're still like trying to find best ways to get in and do this. But what I am going to say is, in particular to DevOps, one of the core tenets and one of the core concepts of DevOps is to try and minimize the silos that we have between roles. So one of the big things that we wind up having in the past is we'll have a systems engineer, and that's all that their job is just to focus in on setting up all my systems. And that's it. That's all that they do on a given day. And they'll have developers, and all that they do in a given day is they just write code and they just write code. And the problem that we wind up having in that environment is we get a lot of finger pointing when things go wrong. And that's not what we want. We want everybody to be involved everywhere, granted to varying degrees, but we want everybody to be involved everywhere. And so I want my sysadmins to understand a little bit about what the code is doing. And I want my developers to understand a little bit about what the environment is that we're going to be deploying to. Because at the end of it all, we all want to be responsible. We all share responsibility here. And so that's one very big thing with DevOps is we want to try and bring a lot of that together. So hopefully that answers the question there.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and get that one off the screen. Do you want to move to another, or do you want to start the lab?
Let's see. Let's do one more. I also do want to mention I've got a little private chat. I'm going to mention Javier here, who mentioned that he also wants to add to the chat, and he calls out the fact that it varies by organization, which is very, very, very true. And I would also, if I can give like a little bit of career advice here as well, is when you go in for an interview or you're reading through a job description, one very big thing to always remember is that you're interviewing them just as much as they're interviewing you. So ask those questions, find out what that role is going to be, because sometimes what somebody might use as a role title is going to be a little bit different than what somebody else is going to do. And in large organizations, that might even vary from team to team. So yeah, that's a great call out. Thank you for adding that in, Javier. Okay, let's do one more, and then we can go ahead and kick into the demo here.
All right, go ahead and pick one, and I'll push it up on the screen.
Let's see. How about so Ronnie asked the question, what's a good initial split ratio for blue-green deployment? And I'm going to give maybe an unsatisfying answer, which is it depends. So a lot of organizations will sort of start with like a 20% split. And I think that if you were looking for like a rule of thumb, that's a good starting point. Just like start moving over 20% and then start to step up from there. But that really is going to depend on your environment. It's going to depend on your organization. It's going to depend on like how large your application is, how many people are hitting it, how many calls are being made, et cetera. So it is going to vary an awful lot. But if you were looking for a rule of thumb, I think 20% is a good place to start. So, yeah.
Right on. Let's go ahead and transition to the demo, and we'll get to the other questions afterwards.
I love it. Okay, let me do a couple of things. So let me hit the little share screen button, and I want my entire screen and screen one. And let me go ahead and share, and then let me kind of move a couple of things around. Okay. And it looks like my screen is sharing. Yes, yes, yes. Fantastic. Okay, cool. So let's explore our environment here. So what we want to do is we want to take our microservice and we want to deploy that out. And we want to incorporate a Canary test to go along with that. So we want to put it out there. It's going to be on a production server, but hidden. We want to touch it really quick, make sure that it works. And then once we confirm that it works, then we'll go ahead and migrate everybody over to that new service. Okay, now let's kind of walk through the lab, and I'm going to do this very quickly. So my intention here is not for people to follow along, but rather just to highlight what it is that we're going to be doing in here. And so some of this I've already gone through on my own. I'm going to be running this locally rather than necessarily in the environment, just to make things a little easier on myself. So some of this I've already done. So I've already got an Azure account. I've already logged into Azure.
Sorry to interrupt. Can I have you zoom in just a little bit?
Sure.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
Okay. You are very welcome. All right, let me see if I can bring the unicorn kind of back to a proper shape. Okay, there we go. All righty. Cool, cool, cool. So I've already logged in. I've already got the extension that I need. And so the next part here that I will need to do is to create my resource group. So I'm just going to copy the code, and then I'm going to come over here. Let me zoom in on that as well. There we go. And just I'm going to run that from my command line. So what I'm doing here is I'm creating what's known as a resource group. So we're deploying this out to Azure. We could have deployed this out to anywhere, but I'm deploying this out to Azure. And in Azure, we have this thing called a resource group. And a resource group is a group of resources. And what's great about a resource group is, especially in an environment like this, where after I'm done, maybe I want to go ahead and just clean everything up. All that I have to do is just delete the resource group. So it makes my life a little bit easier here to do exactly that. So, yeah, so we've got our resource group. The output looks a little bit like that. Cool. Next is if you're going to use the Git command line, then what you can do is go ahead and log in and do all of that on your own. I'm actually going to not use the Git command line, but rather I'm going to interact with my repository a little bit differently. So I'm not going to worry about the GH, but I am going to do one real quick thing here, which is to clone the lab locally. So let me actually do this, is create my Microservices March directory. So boop, sound effects help, by the way. And then let me go ahead and clone my repository. And I'm going to do that by going to my repository over here, code, and then there is the URL, and then let's say git clone, boop, and then paste that in. Okay, and like I said, I know I'm moving kind of quickly through this. My goal is really just to kind of show off what it is that you'll be doing, and kind of hit a couple of high-level points. So I know that I'm moving a little quickly here. Okay, so now I've got that all set up. My next step is to create the application. Make sure I'm inside of platform. Okay. So next up is to create that initial app. We're going to do this from the command line. And the command line that we're going to use here is this little thing called AZ container wrap up. And I'm going to run this in the background and then talk about what we've got going on here. So this syntax, this pattern that you're seeing right here is a relatively common pattern in the Azure command line, which is the name of the service that I want, and then up. And what that will do is that will take whatever it is that we've got locally, and it will just push it up to the cloud. And it will create all of the appropriate services that we need. So it just streamlines things, just make things a little quicker for us. Now, it needs to know a couple of pieces of information. It needs to know the name of the resource group, which we've got. It needs to know the name of the container that we want to use, which we've got. Then it needs to know, hey, where is the source code? And our source code exists inside of a little folder called ingress. And if you open up that ingress folder, what you're going to notice is a Docker file. That's our microservice. That's the one that we are deploying right here. Our ingress option is set to external. That is a container apps option to determine whether or not we're going to allow the outside world to connect to that deployed container. We're going to set this to allow traffic in from port 80. And then last but not least is we're going to set that location to West US. So that's where that's going to be hosted as far as like physically goes inside of Azure. Now, don't worry too much if you're not necessarily close to West US. That's going to be fine. You're not going to notice really any big performance difference there. Okay. And so now it's doing its thing. So now it's creating a couple of different odds and ends that we're going to need. In particular, it's creating a little log environment that it's going to be able to write messages out to. And it's creating a little thing called a container registry that we're also going to need to make sure that we have as well. So it's got a container registry that it has created. Okay. Now, there's a couple of pieces of information that I'm going to need here. The first is going to be this little thing right here, which is the name of the that Azure Container Registry. That's what ACR stands for. Let me just scroll up and go find that. My text is so big, it's making it a little trickier for me to go through. Here it is. Perfect. Okay, just going to copy that whole thing and let me paste that over here. Can I make this bigger. View, is there a zoom? There is. Ah, okay, that was not the command stroke that I was expecting. There we go, nice and big. Okay, so that is, that's the name right there that I need. And then that's the full URL for my container registry. All right, so that's the first little thing that we're gonna need. Cool, cool, cool. The next thing that we're going to notice is that it tells us down at the very bottom here that it created that application, and you're going to notice that it's got a funny little URL on it. And this is part of container apps. This is just to try and avoid any possible name clashes. If this was going to be a real world thing and you wanted to set a custom domain on it, then you could absolutely do that as well. So let me go grab that URL that's going to be down here at the very bottom. Boo-boo-boo. Copy and paste that. Okay. I think I've got everything that I need on that. Yep. And let's just check to make sure that that it's alive after I do one other thing. Okay. The last little thing that I'm doing here is this. I'm making a real quick update to my container app, and I'm setting the mode to allow for multiple containers. That's going to allow for multiple revisions. That's going to allow me to push out the new version, hide it from people, and then go back and test it. So that's what that little option right there is doing for me. Okay. And while that's running, I can multitask a little bit, and let's just make sure that our health is coming through. I need this URL, boop. And let's use that. Okay, so what we're seeing back here is that, okay, this is sort of like us pointing the little laser at the moon. There's a little spot on the moon. It will actually bounce back. It's basically what we're doing right here. So this is me making sure that this was deployed out. So that's what I've now proven. And we've now got that update to be multiple. So now we've got somewhere that we're going to be able to push our updated versions to. Cool. Let's go ahead and move on to the next step. All righty. Hit start. Okay. Now, this part here is going to be a little bit fiddly. And unfortunately, there's a couple of different ways that we could have done this. This is going to be a little bit fiddly. The good news is that this is not something that you wind up having to do on a regular basis. What this is in order for us to be able to automate out our deployment, we need an account. We need to tell our GitHub workflow, hey, these are the credentials that you're going to be able to use. We need to set up those credentials. So that's what we're going to be doing right here, is setting up those credentials. So let me go ahead and walk through this. So the first thing that we need to know is what's the ID of that container registry? Because as part of the process, we need to push out a new container that's going to be hosted inside the registry. We need to know where that registry is. We need to know what the ID of it is so we can set some permissions. So that's the first thing. And that's going to give us back this really, 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 really long piece. That is the full ID for that registry. This is eventually what we're going to set our permissions to. All right. Next up is we need to figure out what ID is currently there to be able to grant the permissions to. So let me go grab that and paste that. Copy and paste. Come here. Where are you not copying? do it the old-fashioned way. Oop, and this is pleasant. Okay. Why are you all of a sudden not? All right. Why is that tab just now not allowing for copy anymore? Oh, that's interesting. Okay. It's not allowing anything anymore. That's why. Fine. I'll go to a new tab. We can make this work. All right. Take two. There we go. Try that again. Okay. This will take just a moment. It's going to go get that identity for us. Quick sip of coffee. And eventually what we're going to want is that principal ID. It's just going to be on the left. There it is. Cool. So let's go grab that piece of information. There we go. Let's paste that down there. Okay. And now we're ready to create the role assignment and then eventually go get our credentials. So a couple more big commands. So let's set this up so that resource ID is the big long one that we had before. And then that principal ID is that GUID that we had right from above. I know there's probably a shortcut key. I'm still relatively new to Mac. I'm going to openly admit that. So all the shortcut keys that I'm used to on Windows, and I love shortcut keys, they all behave differently or sometimes the same on Mac, and it still confuses me. So I know there's probably a shortcut key to have bounced around that a little faster, but that's all right. We got there. Okay. We'll create that role assignment. That is perfect. So now that has permissions, and now I can set the account specific to the registry. And like I said at the top, I know this is a bit fiddly. I know this is a little bit tedious. The nice thing is that this only needs to be done just this one time here. So we are going to be good after all of that. So, all right. Give that just a second to finish out. Moving your mouse makes it go faster. Or that's at least what I like to try to tell myself. We'll do a little dance. I can try Control B to back up a word. Interesting. Okay, I'll have to give that a shot. Okay. There we go. Perfect. All right. Now I can go get the big credential that I need. So let me paste that in. I need my subscription ID. Do I have that on my screen? Do I need to go grab that? I've got it on my screen. I'm just going to grab that from above. The lab actually has the instructions on how to go grab that manually. But since I knew what it was I was looking for, I was able to just go scroll up and go grab it. Make my life a little easier. Yes, I do, by the way, in case you were curious, I do actually make sound effects when I'm doing development. Like this is everything that you're seeing here. This is literally the way that I do development. Sound effects help. All right. Okay. So I know that was a little bit fiddly. You can really just take that as kind of rote code. There's also a lot of things that you could do to maybe streamline this a little bit if you were going to be like writing out a bash shell script and so forth. But again, this is not something that you have to do on the regular. So I apologize for the bit of tediousness that we had there. Okay. So I now have everything that I need. So what I've done is I've deployed out that initial version of the app. I've set up all of the appropriate permissions. I've grabbed the information that I need. And now I'm ready to configure my action. So let's get into that. Let's get into what I think anyway is the good stuff. Let's get on to the next page here. There we go. Okay. So what we want to do is we want to create a workflow that's going to deploy this out. But as we mentioned, we need to make sure that my workflow has the appropriate information to do its thing. That it has the right credentials, that it has the right URLs, that it has all of that information. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to set those up as secrets inside of our GitHub repository. And so there'll be a few secrets that we need to go in and create. So the first one that I'm going to create is Azure Credentials, which is that big JSON block that we just grabbed. So I can do that by kicking over here to my repository, scrolling on down into my secrets and variables, and then into actions. And now I create a brand new secret. This was called Azure Credentials. And then that needs that JSON. There we go. Cool. So let's paste that in and add that secret. Now, what's really cool about the way that that secret is going to be managed is you're going to notice that if I go in to edit it, that I actually can't see it. That's all write only. So this is going to be properly secured. And you'll even notice that in like logs for a workflow running, that value is not going to be printed out. So that's going to be completely tucked away. So now I need my container app name and my resource group. So let's create those real quick. Container app name, which was my container app. Very creative. And then my resource group, which was my container app RG. Again, very creative with the naming. And then last but not least is the ACR name. Let me do that. And let me go grab that value, which was up here. Cool. Beautiful. Okay. And it is worth highlighting the fact that while I did all of that through the UI, you could actually do all of that through the CLI as well. So if you wanted to use the GH CLI, you could have done it that way as well. Cool. In my case, though, I just used the UI, and now I'm going to start setting up my workflow. Now, there's a couple of different ways that we can create a workflow. That one thing that we could do here is we could go over to Actions, and then we could say, set up a workflow ourselves. And then what you're going to notice is that will actually create a brand new file inside of .github/workflows. We could also, if we were using a local editor, just create the file manually that way as well. Or we could use one of my favorite little tricks, which is this. So inside the browser, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit dot on the keyboard. And this will open up a web editor that I can now use, and it behaves an awful lot like Visual Studio Code, just a little bit more streamlined. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up that GitHub folder right there. I'm going to create a brand new folder called workflows, like that. Hit enter, and then create a brand new file inside of here. And I'm going to call this main.yml, main.yaml. When you're naming your workflow files, make sure that you're choosing a good name, a name that's going to make sense. And let's start building this up. Okay. I want... Oh, okay. Sorry, things were in a spot I wasn't expecting. Do I have all the branches? I don't. What? I apologize. I was expecting something different here. I want MM23. Okay, and then main YAML. Okay, here we go. Sorry about that. All right. So let's talk through all of this. I just did a real big copy and paste here. So let's go ahead and break down what we've got. So up at the very top of every workflow file that you're going to have is going to be a name. And that name is what is going to eventually display inside of that Actions tab. So again, naming things is really important. I know I'm kind of harping on something that's a little bit funny here, but it is very important to make sure that we've got that name set up properly, because it's just going to make our lives easier later on. So we've got a good name here. The next is going to be the on command. And this is when we want this to run. And there's a lot of different ways that you could potentially approach how we want this to happen. So in this case here, it's going to be whenever code is pushed to this branch, or whenever a pull request is being made to a particular branch. And like I mentioned, again, there's a lot of different ways that we could do this. That you might have like a deploy branch. You might have a process for where it's going to run on a PR into a branch, and then we're going to do a little bit of testing, and then eventually we'll merge it in if everything succeeds. Like, there's a lot of different approaches that you could take here. For the sake of streamlining things, make my time a little bit easier here, I'm just going to do this for push onto main. So when we push code into main, that's when it's going to push out the updates. I'm just going to make my life a little easier here. I know this is a little different from the layout, but I just want to make sure that I'm able to get through everything. So just going to make that real quick update. Next is what we want it to do. So this is when we want it to do it. This is what we want to do. And inside of here, we can define one or more jobs. Jobs are a great way to take a complex workflow and break it down into smaller chunks. So, for example, we've got a build deploy job right here, and then we've got our test deployment job right here. So we've broken this down into kind of logical groups. So the build deploy is going to push everything out, and the test deploy is going to make sure that everything works. Pretty logical. The one big thing to keep in mind about the way that jobs work inside of GitHub Actions is that they're going to run in parallel. They're going to run all at once, unless I create dependencies. So this little needs build deploy is going to go, hey, don't run this until this up here is run. So we're creating that relationship. So we'll run the build deploy, and then it will run the test. So let's open up this build deploy. You'll notice that this is going to run on Ubuntu. And then we've got a couple of steps here. First is to go grab the code. So that's going to check out all of our code. Next is going to log into Azure. That's going to use the credentials. And then down below is actually going to do exactly what we did earlier. That if you remember earlier when we deployed out that first version that we used AZ container wrap, we're going to do the exact same thing here, which is pretty cool. So we're going to install the extension. If there's any updates that need to be made, we're going to say, hey, go ahead and do it. And then we're going to use that exact same CLI tool that we had before to deploy out our code. So it needs to know the name of the container app, it needs to know the resource group, it needs to know where our code is, and that was checked out from before. So it creates this little folder for us automatically called workspace. We go into the ingress folder, which is where our Docker file is. And then last but not least is the name of the container registry. So that's going to go grab the code, log into Azure, and push everything up. With everything pushed up, the next thing then that we want to do is validate to make sure that everything looks good. And so what this is going to do is it's once again going to log into Azure, and then it's going to go through a couple little steps. So when we pushed out that new container, we hit it. Problem is we hit it a little too good. We need to figure out where it is. And that's what this is going to do right here, is it's going to figure out where it is. What's the name of that new revision? And what's the FQDN of that new revision? That's what this block right here is going to do. What did we do here? Let's figure out where it is. Once we figure out where it is, then we can go ahead and do a real quick check. So we're using an action from the marketplace to do that check. And we're going to point it at that FQDN, that fully qualified domain name, of that newest revision. So we're going to test that. And if it turns out that it succeeds, fantastic. We're going to route all traffic to it. And if it turns out that it fails, well, then we're just not going to route any new traffic to it. So that's what all of this is going to do right here. Cool. So let me go take a look at all of my updates here. And I'm just going to push this straight up. Let's say created a workflow, just like that. And then let me push that up, which it did. So if I go to Tom, go, and I take a look at things, what you're going to notice is now there's this little yellow dot here. And if I go to my actions here, what we're going to notice is that our workflow is now running. And the reason that it's running is because of the fact that we pushed out a change into our main branch here. Okay. Now, if I open this up, I can actually see what's going on behind the scenes here and kind of watch it as it goes. And it's going to do all of its magic here. So we can actually see it now deploying out the container. One of the things that you're going to notice is these little asterisks. That's because when it went to print out what we stored as a secret, it's not going to do that. It's going to hide that there as an asterisk. And so now if I keep on scrolling down, we can actually see that it built everything up. It is now pushing our container app up. Give that just a second here. And all of that looked good. That's now green. And now it moves on to the test deployment. And we'll give that a second to do its thing. There we go. Chugga. And you'll notice down at the very bottom here, okay, success. So now it goes, it succeeded, enabling the new revision, and eventually it will come to life. All right. And I can actually test this as well. Let me go grab this right here. Let me copy that, and let's go back over here. And I'm going to say, I'm going to clear my screen, make it a little easier. And let's go ahead and Control B. Let me say curl, and then go to whack health. And then this should come back with an OK. Health. Oop, OK, cool. Comes back with an OK. Now, let's kind of let that keep doing its thing there. It's just going to take it a moment to finish that out. But while that's doing its thing, I'm going to start doing something bad here. So I'm going to go into this template, and I'm going to go find the health spot here, which is returning my 200. Okay, there it is. And I'm going to update this to be 500, and I'm going to say not okay, because this is decidedly not okay. 500, of course, is an error code. So once this finishes its thing here, which is just going to take it a second, system performance is always inversely proportional to the number of people watching. If you need it to move fast, that's when it's going to move slow. Come on. There we go. Oh, that's interesting. That failed out. Uh-oh. Is it because it ran it? This has worked. This worked. Has always worked for me. That is so funny. Joys of a live demo, indeed. You know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to rerun, and I'm actually just going to rerun the failed job here. It's actually one of my favorite little features in Actions, is just that ability to just rerun the failed job. So you'll notice that my test deploy just went straight to green, and then let's just redo that test. And I just want to get this to work. And then I'll show the bad update. It's always funny when you're doing a demo where, hey, I'm going to introduce a fail, and then all of a sudden the demo says, hey, you know what? I'm going to beat you to it. I'm just going to go ahead and fail right now. It's always fun. All right. Give this a second. Okay, so it tested our app. We can actually see it came back with the OK success. That's perfect. And then now it's going to make the update. Okay, cool. It succeeded that time. All right, excellent. That's exactly what we wanted to have happen. So now let me come back over to my code. I've got my bad change here, and let's just push that. And again, I'm just going to push it straight to main. So bad change. Wouldn't it be nice if all commit messages that introduced a bug had a nice clear commit message like that? Wouldn't that be great? All right. In any event, let's come back over here to our actions and our bad change, and let's let this run in the background here. So I'm going to kind of let that keep doing its thing. It's going to do exactly like it did before. It's going to log into Azure. It's going to deploy the container, and then eventually it's going to test it. I'm going to come back and show that it didn't actually deploy the change out here in a minute, but I want to stop for any Q&A and to also give you the opportunity to start using and start going through the lab. So,
we do have one question we haven't gotten to in the Q&A.
Yep.
Let's see if I can toss that up on the slide. Okay. Does DevOps include DBA operations?
It does. Yeah, absolutely. That, you know, when you're thinking about your application, the database absolutely is part of that. And so, you know, even if I'm using what's known as NoSQL or sometimes like schema lists, where I'm not necessarily having to structurally update the database, but I'm modifying the way that my objects are stored, we still need to think about all of that. So if I am changing the schema, if I'm changing the structure of the objects and how I'm going to store that, like all of those are big changes, and that absolutely does need to be incorporated into this process. So I need to make sure that I've got scripts that are going to make the appropriate updates, that I've got scripts that can roll that back, that I've got scripts that can go ahead and test all of that. And then there's also like, you know, some additional concerns that I have to take into account, that when we're talking about like minimizing downtime, if I modify a database and I've got services that like depend on that old version, that can start lead to problems. And so I may need to take a look at like replicating a database or creating a separate environment that we can then migrate everything back over into the original environment and things like that. So 100% that DBA operations is part of DevOps. And quite frankly, it's one that's often overlooked, that we're always thinking about, what about my code and what about all the different services? And so frequently that's overlooked. That's such a great question. Thank you for asking that.
Right on.
The question is,
so we're through with the Q&A,
okay.
unless other questions come in. So we have about 50 minutes left in our time here. Do you have a couple more things to show at the demo, or do you want to get people into the lab? How do you want to?
The joy of live demos, indeed.
I know, right?
This is so funny.
It's not happy with you.
No, this is hilarious. This has all, I like a little bit of behind the scenes. Like, we spent a lot of time building this out, putting this together, testing it, and making sure that it ran. And yeah, that's it's so funny that that failed out. Anyway, yeah, let's go ahead and get everybody on into the lab. Let's get everybody like doing the thing, especially since we've got about 45 minutes left here.
Okay. So let's see here. Let me advance forward one. You can end your screen share.
Okay.
I always remind to end it because I always forget.
Oh yeah.
So I'll let you start from the where do we go from here, and then we'll get into the lab.
Sure. Yeah. So where do we go from here? So number one is see what it is that you can automate. So, and I want to make sure that I highlight that word automate. And I didn't use the phrase CI/CD. And do not get me wrong, like CI/CD is very, very, very important. But automation goes beyond that. So look for places where you're constantly doing the same thing over and over again. See where it is that you can automate things. Number two, use branches to test new things. That create a branch and go play, go explore. Don't be afraid to break things because you've got that existing code. And I want to make sure that I highlight that's true even if you're the only developer. Still use branches, still follow good processes. And then last but not least is to explore the marketplace. That you're going to see a whole host of actions that have been created by different vendors, by the community, that can do all sorts of really neat things and really help out your automation. And if you see me kind of like glancing away, it's because everything is now running correctly the next time. Now that nobody's looking, everything is working correctly.
Of course it is. That's how it always works.
Of course it is. Yeah.
So I want to highlight a comment in the chat I thought you might enjoy from Fernando. He says, I've been using GitHub Actions as a CI tool for the last year or so, and I've been having such a good time with it due to features like rerun failed jobs being so discoverable and working as expected.
I love that. That's great feedback. Thank you very much. Thank you, Fernando. I appreciate that.
All right. So yeah, let's get into it, right?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. I will go ahead and drop the link in the attendee chat as well, but you can get to the lab either through the related content box or that link that I just put in the attendee chat. Please note, you are going to need both Azure and GitHub accounts to do it. So if you don't have them already, please, before you spin up the lab, go make sure you have those accounts. And it does need to be a non-work account for Azure. We find that if it's a work account, some funky things can happen. So if you don't have a non-work account, you can get a free trial. So once you're past that little bit of setup, we'll be here, same as previous sessions, to answer questions. Just get logged in using your same email address from registration. We may bump up against our hard stop at 10 o'clock Pacific. But again, if we run out of time, if you don't finish the lab while we're still here live, there will be people in Slack who can help you. And then the environment that Christopher was using is the same one that you'll be using. So it looks pretty familiar. You can adjust the pane. You can see how much time is left. You click check in order to run a script to make sure that you've gotten through it. And then at the end, just making sure that you click finish. So that said, I see there's a question in the Q&A that also got answered in the attendee chat. So I think we're probably okay there. So what Christopher and I will do is just go off camera and be quiet so you can focus on the lab. And we'll keep an eye on the chat and the Q&A. And if something comes up, we'll just come back on and chat it through. All right.
Thank you.
May the demo gods be with you. Hey, Christopher, if you can come on for a second, we have some questions about the requirement to create accounts and the Azure account. So one person is saying, do we have a test account for this lab? I don't want to create a free account now because I will waste my credits.
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have a test account for that. Unfortunately, that we could give out. If you're, yeah, I don't know what a great solution to that is. Unfortunately, yeah, because unfortunately we don't have a test account that's set up for this.
Okay, and I see someone in the Q&A is saying they don't have an Azure subscription. How do they finish the lab? So again, you can create an account with a free
Yeah, you can
trial.
create a test account. So when you create the test account, it is going to require a credit card, but it's not going to bill anything. And then the big thing that you just make sure to do at the end, and this is going to be true universally, is just make sure you delete the resource group after you're done walking through the lab to clean everything up. But nothing that you're going to be doing today is going to go beyond anything that's provided by the free trial. And if you already have an Azure account, the other thing that I'm going to say is that going through this exercise is literally going to cost a couple of pennies. That there's just a little bit that's needed for the storage, and it like literally is like a couple of pennies. If you just delete the resource group, then it goes away after that.
All right, we are coming to the end of our time here. It looks like we don't have any questions in the Q&A or anything going on in the chat, so I think we'll start our wrap up. Christopher, are you with us? There we go.
I am. I just needed to find the right buttons.
The buttons, right? There's always too many of them. Thank you so much for your time today. And I don't know, I think it's always interesting to watch things being troubleshooted more than things going perfectly. So well done.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you to everyone who is here today. Again, if you're still working on the lab, we'll be over in Slack. And again, we won't be requiring this lab as a badge requirement. It'll be we'll call it extra credit.
There we go. Thank you to everybody for tuning in. Hopefully you learned a little something about DevOps, about Blue-Green, about Canary deployment. And you can come find me on LinkedIn at Geek Trainer, and I'll be keeping an eye on the Slack as well. So thank you to everybody.